The notice appeared on my windshield sometime between dusk and morning, folded once, pressed flat as if it had been measured for the glass. I noticed it before unlocking the building, a white rectangle under the wiper, printed text facing outward. No handwriting, no warning tape, just a clean sheet with a seal at the top and a bold reference number underneath. It named a rule I hadn't agreed to and a deadline I hadn't acknowledged. I stood there longer than necessary, reading it twice while people passed through the shared walkway behind me. The HOA logo sat in the corner, modest but confident. The language was formal and calm, explaining that I was in violation of parking restrictions and needed to relocate my vehicle immediately to avoid further action. The parking area had always existed in a gray zone. Residents assumed it was governed by the HOA because signs nearby referenced community guidelines. In practice, the asphalt belonged to the underlying parcel, which predated the association by years. I had learned that during acquisition, when the title report noted easements but no transfer of control. I folded the notice back into its original crease and placed it on the passenger seat. Then I unlocked the door and went inside. Later that afternoon, I found a second notice taped to the entry panel near the mailboxes. This one was addressed to resident. It repeated the violation and added a line about continued noncompliance. The wording was careful, almost polite. It assumed familiarity. That was when I met her. She was standing near the directory, holding a clipboard, reviewing something on a tablet. Mid-30s, composed posture, neutral expression. When she looked up, she didn't smile, but she didn't frown either. "Sir," she said, "I'm with the HOA. We've sent 2 notices regarding your vehicle." I nodded once. "I received them." She waited, pen poised, expecting the next step to be compliance or explanation. "I'm not in your HOA," I said. There was a pause, not long, but long enough to register. She glanced at the building number, then back at me. "Our records show this address is subject to association rules," she replied evenly. "The shared areas are regulated." "I understand what your records show," I said. "They don't apply to me." She didn't argue, she made a note. "Then we'll need to escalate for clarification," she said. "Until then, please relocate the vehicle." I didn't move it. I didn't explain further. I simply thanked her and went back inside. As the door closed, I could feel the discomfort settle. Not anger, not hostility, but uncertainty. And uncertainty, once logged, has a way of growing. The second interaction began with a clipboard instead of a conversation, which told me more than her words ever could. I arrived the next morning to find a small orange marker placed behind my rear tire. Not a citation, not a tow notice, just a presence. The kind meant to suggest observation rather than punishment. It was subtle, almost courteous. I left it where it was and went about my day. By mid-afternoon, the marker was gone. In its place, another printed notice had been slipped under my door. This one referenced the prior communication and noted that failure to comply could result in enforcement action under HOA bylaws. The language was more detailed now, citing sections and subsections, as though precision itself could resolve uncertainty. I read it slowly, then set it aside with the others. Documentation matters, but timing matters more. She returned that evening. This time, she didn't wait near the directory. She stood directly in the parking area next to my car, reviewing her tablet. When I approached, she acknowledged me with a small nod, professional and unembarrassed. "We've confirmed the parcel is within the association's operational footprint," she said. "Your refusal to comply has been noted." "I'm not refusing," I replied. "I'm declining jurisdiction." She paused at that. "Not to challenge it, but to process the phrasing. Our authority extends to shared land and structures used by residents," she said. "That includes this area." Assumed use isn't the same as ownership, I said, keeping my voice neutral. She tapped the screen, pulling up a map I couldn't see clearly from where I stood. Colored outlines, labels, the visual confidence of records assembled by someone else. Our survey shows otherwise, she said. I'm sure it does. That answer earned another pause, longer this time. She looked up, meeting my eyes directly, assessing whether I was uninformed or simply uncooperative. I let the silence do the work. Sir, she said, if this continues, we may have to involve enforcement to resolve the matter. I nodded. That's your process. She didn't threaten, she didn't raise her voice. She simply documented the exchange, her pen moving carefully, deliberately. Before leaving, she placed a final notice on my windshield. This one referenced escalation procedures and included a date and time window. It was still polite, still procedural, but it carried weight. As she walked away, I noticed her slow slightly, as if replaying the interaction in her head. Authority functions best when it's unquestioned. Once questioned, even gently, it starts to feel heavier. I didn't move the car that night. Not because I wanted to provoke anything, but because clarity arrives faster when assumptions are allowed to reach their natural conclusion. The knock came just after 8, measured and unhurried, the kind that assumed cooperation before resistance. I opened the door to find her standing alone, no clipboard this time, just a slim folder tucked under her arm. The hallway lights reflected off the polished concrete floor, emphasizing the shared nature of the space. One of those subtle design choices that encouraged the idea of collective ownership without ever stating it outright. "Good morning," she said. "May we talk?" I stepped aside to let her in, though she remained just inside the threshold, careful not to cross too far. That restraint wasn't accidental. It was procedural. "I wanted to give you a final opportunity to resolve the parking issue before we proceed further," she said. "The HOA prefers voluntary compliance." "I appreciate that," I replied. She opened the folder and removed a single page. It wasn't a warning. It was a summary, dates, times, references to notices delivered, a clean narrative of noncompliance. "Our board reviewed this last night," she continued. "They've authorized enforcement if the violation remains unresolved." "Enforcement meaning?" She met my gaze again. "Law enforcement assistance, to confirm occupancy status and ensure compliance with community regulations." The phrasing was careful. Assistance, confirm, ensure, no accusations, no raised stakes beyond what was necessary. "I understand," I said. She waited. The pause was deliberate, a final opening for me to explain myself in terms she could accept. "I'm not part of the HOA," I repeated calmly. "I don't fall under its authority." She closed the folder. "Our records don't support that," she said, "and without documentation we have to rely on what's on file." "That makes sense." The conversation stalled there, balanced on a narrow edge of mutual professionalism. She wasn't offended, I wasn't defensive. We were simply standing on opposite sides of an assumption. "Then we'll proceed as outlined," she said. "An officer will be present later today." I nodded once. "I'll be here." She hesitated at the door just briefly, as though considering whether to ask something else. Instead, she straightened and left without another word. The rest of the morning passed quietly. I reviewed emails, signed off on routine maintenance approvals, and made a note to pull a specific document from storage later. Not for leverage, for accuracy. By early afternoon, the parking area had taken on a different atmosphere. People moved through it more cautiously. A few glanced at my car, then at the posted HOA signage, then away again. Assumptions spread faster than facts. When the patrol vehicle finally pulled in, it didn't use lights or sirens. It parked neatly within the lines, as if careful not to violate anything itself. I watched from the doorway as the officer stepped out, adjusting his belt, scanning the area. She arrived moments later, folder back under her arm, expression unchanged. They spoke quietly. She gestured toward my vehicle, toward the building, toward me. I closed the door behind me and walked out to meet them, feeling the weight of the moment, not dramatic, not tense, but precise. This was the point where paperwork either held or failed. The officer introduced himself first, voice even, posture relaxed. No urgency, no presumption of guilt. He explained they had been asked to assist the HOA in clarifying a compliance issue related to parking and residency status. She stood beside him, hands folded around the folder, allowing the process to take its course. "Sir," the officer said, "are you the registered occupant of this unit?" "I'm the owner of the property," I replied. The statement landed quietly, not dramatically, just a fact offered without emphasis. He nodded, absorbing it. "Do you have identification or documentation to support that?" "Not on me," I said. "But I can retrieve it." She shifted slightly, not startled, not skeptical, just recalibrating. Ownership wasn't part of the script she'd been working from. "That would be helpful," the officer said. I stepped inside and returned with a small folder I kept for routine matters. Deeds, surveys, correspondence. Not everything, just enough to establish context. I handed him the top document. He scanned it slowly, eyes moving from name to parcel number to date. Then he turned to the second page, then the third. He didn't rush. Accuracy matters more than speed in these moments. "This indicates you hold title to the underlying parcel," he said finally. "Yes," I replied. He glanced toward her, then back at the paperwork. "And this predates the formation of the HOA?" "It does." She stepped closer now, careful to maintain her composure. "Our association manages the shared areas under recorded agreements," she said. "Those include this parking lot." I nodded. "They include easements, not transfer of control." The officer raised a hand gently, not to silence her, but to pause the exchange. He reviewed another page, then another. "I don't see language here granting the HOA enforcement authority over this parcel," he said. "At least not on its own." Her brow furrowed slightly, the first visible crack in certainty. "Not frustration, concentration. Our maps show this as common area," she said. "Maps are references," the officer replied. "Titles are determinative." He handed the documents back to me and took a step away from the car, surveying the space again. The painted lines, the signs, the way everything suggested order without actually defining it. "At this time," he said, "there's no basis for enforcement. This appears to be a civil matter regarding boundaries and authority." She nodded once, slowly. "Understood." There was no apology. None was required, no reprimand, just a recalibration of process. The officer excused himself and left as quietly as he'd arrived. We stood there for a moment longer, the parking lot suddenly feeling less certain, less assumed. "I'll need to review this with our board," she said at last. "Of course," I replied. As she walked away, her steps were measured, thoughtful. Authority hadn't vanished. It had simply paused, waiting for verification. And verification, once demanded, tends to ripple outward. The next notice arrived by email rather than paper, which told me the conversation had shifted. It was addressed to me by name this time, not resident. The tone was still formal, but more deliberate, as though each sentence had been reviewed twice before being sent. It acknowledged the prior interaction and stated that the HOA was conducting an internal review of property records related to the shared areas adjacent to my building. No apology, no concession, just process. I replied with a brief confirmation that I was available to provide documentation if needed. Nothing more. There's a tendency in moments like this to over-explain. I've found restraint is usually more effective. 2 days passed without further contact. The parking area returned to its usual rhythm. People parked where they always had. The signs didn't change. The car remained where it was. On the third day, she requested a meeting. We met in the small conference room near the main entrance, a space the HOA often used for administrative matters. The walls were neutral, the table unadorned. A room designed for procedure, not negotiation. She arrived with a thicker folder this time. "Thank you for coming," she said. "We've been reviewing the association's formation documents and subsequent amendments." I waited. "There appears to be an assumption embedded in our operations," she continued, choosing her words carefully, "that certain parcels were incorporated into the HOA's authority when, in fact, they were not." I nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without reacting to it. "Our enforcement actions were based on that assumption," she said, "specifically regarding parking and access control." "And now?" I asked. "Now we're clarifying," she replied, "which takes time." She opened the folder and slid a copy of a map across the table. This one was marked differently, notations in the margins, highlights around boundaries that had previously been treated as fixed. "We'll be suspending enforcement in this area until the review is complete," she said, "including notices and patrols." "That seems reasonable." She looked up at me then, really looked, as though reassessing not just the situation but her initial impression of me. "May I ask why you didn't correct us earlier?" she said. "When we first contacted you." I considered the question before answering. "Because assumptions reveal more when they're allowed to operate," I said. "Correcting them too quickly doesn't always change the system that produced them." She absorbed that in silence. "I see," she said finally. The meeting ended without ceremony. No handshake, no tension. Just an understanding that something previously taken for granted was now under examination. As I left the room, I passed the posted HOA guidelines near the entrance. They were neatly framed, confidently worded. They hadn't changed, but the meaning behind them had. And once meaning shifts, even quietly, the structure built around it has to adjust, whether it wants to or not. The suspension of enforcement created a kind of quiet vacuum. Without notices or patrols, the parking area felt less managed, though nothing had actually changed. The lines were still painted. The signs still stood, but authority, once paused, leaves a perceptible absence. People sense it even if they can't name it. I noticed residents hesitating before parking, glancing at the signage, then at my building. A few conversations stopped when I walked by. Nothing overt, just recalculation. She didn't contact me for nearly a week. When she did, it was to request additional documentation. Deeds, correspondence from the original developer, and a survey that showed how access easements had been granted without surrendering ownership. I provided copies electronically, each file labeled, each page legible. Clarity works best when it's easy to verify. Her response was brief. "Received, thank you." 2 days later, she asked to walk the property together. We met in the late afternoon when the lights softened and the parking area was half full. She carried no folder this time, just a notepad. The walk was slow, deliberate, tracing boundaries that had existed long before either of us had been involved. "This curb line," she said, gesturing with her pen, "was assumed to mark the edge of common area." "It was poured as a visual guide," I said, "not a legal one." She nodded, writing that down. We stopped near the shared entrance, where a small plaque displayed the HOA name. It had been installed after the association formed, bolted into masonry that predated it. "Our signage suggests inclusion," she said. "Signage suggests intent," I replied, "not authority." She smiled faintly at that, not amused, but acknowledging the distinction. As we walked, she asked procedural questions. When had I acquired the property? Whether there were leases tied to association rules. How maintenance was coordinated. None of it felt adversarial. It felt corrective. At one point, she stopped and looked out across the lot, measuring distances with her eyes. "This changes how we've been operating," she said, "not just here." "I imagine it does." She closed her notebook. "The board will need to formally recognize this. There are steps." "I'm not in a hurry," I said. She looked at me then, a flicker of something like relief crossing her expression. Not because the issue was resolved, but because it wasn't going to be rushed into another assumption. As we parted, she paused. "For what it's worth," she said, "you handled this professionally." "So did you," I replied. That night the parking lot was full, no markers, no notices, just cars parked where people believed they belonged. Belief, I'd learned, is often the last thing to change, long after the paperwork catches up. The board meeting took place without me. I knew that because she told me afterward, not because I was invited. The email arrived late in the evening, time-stamped just after 9, its subject line neutral, Property Boundary Review Update. She summarized the discussion in 3 short paragraphs. The HOA board had reviewed the documentation, consulted their retained counsel, and acknowledged that certain enforcement assumptions had been made in error. Language like that doesn't admit fault. It redirects responsibility into the past tense. Effective but revealing. Enforcement in the parking area would remain suspended indefinitely. Signage would be reviewed, records would be amended. There was one line near the end that stood out. "The association will refrain from further compliance actions regarding your property." Not this issue, not parking, your property. I replied with a simple acknowledgement. The following week, small changes began to appear. A sign near the entrance was removed entirely, leaving behind a lighter rectangle where it had been bolted. Another was rotated slightly, no longer facing my building. These weren't announcements. They were corrections made quietly, the way institutions prefer to revise themselves. She and I crossed paths once during that period near the mailboxes. We exchanged nods, nothing more. The matter was still active, just no longer contested. Then came the question I'd been expecting. She requested a brief meeting, not in the conference room this time, but standing, near the boundary line we'd walked together earlier. No table, no folders, just context. "The board wants to discuss a formal access agreement," she said, "for shared use of the parking area." I considered the phrasing, shared use, not control, not regulation. "I'm open to that," I said. "With clear terms," she nodded. "Of course." We talked through it in broad strokes: maintenance coordination, signage language, notification protocols, nothing binding yet, just framework. At one point she hesitated, then spoke more candidly than she had before. "When you said you weren't part of the HOA," she said, "we assumed resistance, non-compliance." "I know," I replied. "It didn't occur to us that the assumption itself might be the issue." "That happens," I said. "Systems tend to enforce themselves before they verify." She smiled at that briefly. A professional smile, but genuine. As we wrapped up, she gestured toward the lot. "People still think this is HOA controlled," she said. "They probably will for a while," I replied. "Perception lags behind reality." She made a note on her phone, then looked up. "This won't happen again," she said. I believed her, not because she promised it, but because the system that produced the error had now been forced to look at itself. And systems rarely forget moments like that. The access agreement moved slowly, which was exactly how I wanted it. Drafts circulated between email addresses that didn't include residents or board members, only administrators and counsel. Language was tested, softened, then tightened again. Every clause was an attempt to define something that had previously relied on assumption. She kept me updated without commentary. Revised draft attached. Board review pending. Legal has questions regarding maintenance liability. Each message was concise, procedural, and notably absent of urgency. Meanwhile, the day-to-day rhythm of the property continued. I watched residents adjust in small ways. Some stopped referencing the HOA signage entirely. Others still quoted rules out of habit, even when those rules no longer applied. One man asked me directly if parking was allowed now, as though permission had been temporarily restored by some unseen authority. "It was always allowed," I told him. "Nothing changed." He nodded, unconvinced, and walked away. That was the interesting part, how little actual change was required once the illusion of control loosened. The space didn't behave differently. People did. She and I met once more during this period, this time by chance. She was standing near the former sign location, phone pressed to her ear, listening rather than speaking. When she noticed me, she ended the call and approached. "We're updating our internal training materials," she said. "Boundary verification, jurisdiction checks. This situation prompted it." "That's good," I replied. She hesitated, then added, "It also raised questions about other properties, not just yours." I didn't respond immediately. That wasn't my role. "There's a tendency," she continued, "to inherit authority without revisiting its foundation, especially when things have worked a certain way for a long time." I nodded. "Efficiency can look like correctness," she smiled faintly. "Exactly." A few days later, the revised draft arrived. This one was cleaner, no enforcement language, no compliance clauses. Just shared use terms, mutual notice provisions, and a clear acknowledgement of ownership. I signed it and returned it without revision. When she confirmed receipt, she added a short note at the end of her message. "Thank you for your patience throughout this process." It wasn't an apology. It didn't need to be. That evening, I walked the property alone. The parking lot was quiet, half empty, the lines fading where tires had crossed them for years. The shared entrance lights hummed softly. Nothing about the place suggested conflict or resolution. And yet, beneath the surface, something had settled into its proper shape. Authority, once corrected, doesn't announce itself. It simply resumes its appropriate size. I suspected that realization was still working its way through the HOA's systems, slowly, carefully, one document at a time. The finalized agreement was recorded quietly, without ceremony or announcement. She let me know with a single-line email. "The access agreement has been executed and filed." No attachments, no emphasis. Just confirmation that the paperwork had reached its final state. After that, the HOA's presence shifted into something more distant. Not withdrawn, just appropriately placed. Notices continued elsewhere on the property, but none appeared on my building or near the parking area tied to it. The distinction once made was being respected. I noticed the change most clearly in how people spoke. Residents still referenced the HOA, but with qualifiers now. "I think that's under the HOA. I'm not sure if this applies over here." Uncertainty had replaced certainty, and that alone altered behavior. People asked before asserting. They checked before correcting. One afternoon, I saw her speaking with a small group near the shared entrance. She wasn't issuing instructions. She was explaining boundaries, pointing to physical markers that had always been there but rarely considered. When she noticed me, she paused, then continued without adjustment. That told me everything I needed to know. Later that day, she stopped by briefly. "We've updated our internal maps," she said. "They now reflect recorded ownership rather than assumed use." "That's a meaningful distinction," I replied. "It is," she agreed, "and one we should have made earlier." There was no defensiveness in her tone, just acknowledgement. She hesitated, then added, "The officer asked us to close the loop on the call from that day for record keeping." Of course. He noted that the matter was resolved without further action, she said. "That's how it will remain on file." I nodded. The system, once engaged, prefers clean endings. As she turned to leave, she stopped again. "For what it's worth," she said, "this changed how the board views authority. Not just where it exists, but how it's exercised." I considered that. "Authority works best when it's precise," I said, "not expansive." She smiled once, then walked away. That evening, the parking lot filled as usual. Cars lined up where they always had. No one checked signs. No one questioned placement. The space functioned the same as it always had, but now it did so honestly. The situation was resolved in every way that mattered. There were no lingering disputes, no quiet resentments, no follow-up calls. Just a corrected understanding, folded neatly back into routine. And yet, I knew there was one final adjustment still settling, not in documents or procedures, but in perception. Because once authority is revealed to have limits, it never quite regains its old, unexamined shape. The patrol car never returned. There was no follow-up visit, no additional questions, no quiet drive-by meant to reassure anyone that order had been restored. The absence itself became the final confirmation that the matter had resolved in the only way it ever could, through verification, not force. A week later, I received one last message from her. "The board has closed the file." That was all it said. No explanation, no summary, just closure. I saw her once more after that, early in the morning, walking the property alone. No clipboard, no phone. Just a slow circuit of entrances, pathways, and boundaries. She paused near the edge of the parking area, looking out across it as if seeing it clearly for the first time, not as a governed space, but as a defined one. We acknowledged each other with a nod. Nothing needed to be said. Law enforcement had reviewed the documents, noted the ownership, and exited the situation exactly as they should have, calmly, professionally, without escalation. Their role ended the moment facts replaced assumption. That was the quietest authority shift of all. The HOA adjusted in subtler ways after that. Language in notices became more specific. Maps were referenced more carefully. When questions arose, they were framed as inquiries rather than directives. Control didn't disappear, it narrowed. And in doing so, it became more legitimate. As for me, nothing about my behavior changed. The car stayed where it always had. The building operated as it always had. Tenants came and went, unaware that anything unusual had occurred beneath the surface. That, in a way, was the point. Power exercised correctly doesn't draw attention to itself. Ownership, when verified, doesn't need to be announced. And authority, once checked, doesn't have to be defeated. It only has to be placed where it belongs. I never corrected anyone publicly. I never reminded the HOA who owned what. I didn't need to. The documents existed. The boundaries were recorded. The system had adjusted itself around that reality. Months later, a new sign went up near the shared entrance. Smaller, more carefully worded. It referenced guidelines rather than rules, cooperation rather than enforcement. I read it once, then kept walking. The HOA still functioned. The community still operated. But somewhere within its processes, a quiet lesson remained, one learned not through confrontation, but through patience. Because the most lasting authority shift isn't the one that arrives loudly. It's the one that settles in, unnoticed, and never needs to be corrected again.